The metal bleachers were half full and smelled like sunscreen and popcorn when a stranger 3 rows behind me said the sentence that ended my marriage, and he said it like he was commenting on the weather. My name is Ryan. I'm 41, I teach American history at Cedar Falls High, and for the last 4 summers I've helped coach my son Jake's travel baseball team, mostly because it's the only place I've ever felt completely, uncomplicatedly happy. Jake was 9 that July, a wiry kid with a fastball that made grown men whistle and a habit of chewing his glove strap when he was nervous on the mound. He was up 2 outs in the 3rd inning against a tournament team from Waterloo, and I was doing what I always did during his innings, leaning forward, elbows on my knees, holding my breath without noticing I was holding it. The man behind me wasn't talking to me. He was talking to the guy next to him, some older fellow in a faded Cubs cap, and he nodded toward the Waterloo dugout, toward their assistant coach, a tall guy in his 40s with sandy hair going gray at the temples, arms crossed, watching my son's wind-up with the specific attention of someone who used to play the position himself. Wow, the stranger said, laughing a little, he's the spitting image of his dad. I turned around, ready to correct a mistake, ready to say actually, that's not, I'm his dad, right here. But the man wasn't looking at me. He was looking at Jake, and then at the Waterloo coach, back and forth, the way you look at 2 photographs someone's asked you to compare. Todd's kid, right? The man in the Cubs hat said. Didn't know he had one that age. No, that's not his, the first man said, and laughed again, easy, unbothered. Just a crazy resemblance. Same jaw, same way he plants his back foot. Freaked me out for a second. I don't remember deciding to look at the Waterloo dugout. I just found myself looking, and the man they called Todd was still watching my son, still had his arms crossed, and something about the stillness of him, the way he wasn't cheering for either team, just watching one boy, made the back of my neck go cold before my brain had caught up with why. Jake struck the batter out. The parents around me clapped. I clapped too, half a second late, my hands moving without me. I want to tell you that I brushed it off in that moment, because that's the version of the story where I come out looking sensible. I didn't. I sat there for the rest of that half inning with something lodged behind my sternum that I couldn't name yet, and every time I glanced over at that dugout, the man called Todd was still there, still watching, like he had some claim on the field I couldn't see. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up, because you should know who I was before that Tuesday in July, so you understand exactly how far the ground moved. Sarah and I met when I was 28, teaching my 3rd year of history and coaching JV baseball on the side. She was a nurse, 2 years into working nights in the ICU at Covenant, and we met at a mutual friend's 4th of July barbecue where she beat me twice at cornhole and didn't apologize for it. She was direct in a way I found disarming. She'd tell you what she thought without padding it, and something about that felt like relief after years of dating women who circled their real opinions like they were dangerous. We dated for 18 months. She got pregnant faster than we'd planned, 4 months before the wedding date we'd already set, and we laughed about it at the time. Guess we're just efficient, she said, patting her stomach at our engagement dinner. Jake came 7 weeks early, small and yellow with jaundice, 2 weeks in the NICU with wires taped to skin so thin I could see veins through it. I remember holding him through the isolette porthole, terrified, and thinking that fear was the realest thing I'd ever felt. Nobody questioned the timeline. Preemies come early, that's the whole definition of the word. Sarah's due date had been calculated off her last period, and NICU doctors told us gestational dating is an estimate, not a fact, especially with irregular cycles, which Sarah had always had. I never did the math past that. Why would I have? I trusted her the way you trust gravity, not because you've tested it, but because it's never once given you a reason to. That's the thing I keep circling back to now, 2 years after all of it ended. I wasn't a suspicious man. I never checked her phone, never timed her drive home from a shift, never once in 12 years wondered where she'd really been. I called that trust for over a decade. I have a harder time calling it that now. The rest of that tournament day passed the way tournament days do, sunburn, gas station snacks, Jake falling asleep in the back seat with dirt still on his cheek. Sarah had missed the game, working a double at the hospital, and when I got home I found myself standing in the kitchen doorway watching her heat up leftovers, trying to figure out how to ask a question I didn't yet have the shape of. "Weird thing happened at the game today," I said, and she looked up, spoon still in the pot. "Yeah. Some guy said Jake looks just like the Waterloo assistant coach. Guy named Todd." I watched her face. I want to be honest and say that in the moment, I saw almost nothing, a half-second pause, maybe, the spoon stopping for just a beat too long. If you'd shown me a photograph of her expression right then, I might have called it mild confusion. It's only now, replaying it hundreds of times since, that I recognize what that pause actually was. "Small world," she said, and went back to stirring. "People say that kind of thing all the time. Jake's got your chin, everybody says so." I let it go. I told myself it was nothing, a stranger's idle comment, the kind of thing that happens at every kid's sporting event in America, some coincidental resemblance blown up by two bored dads killing time in the bleachers. I put Jake to bed that night, read him half a chapter of a book about dinosaurs, and told myself the tightness in my chest was just tournament exhaustion. It wasn't tournament exhaustion. It was the first thread pulling loose on something that had been stitched shut for 9 years, and some part of me, some part one wasn't ready to listen to yet, already knew it. For about 2 weeks, life went back to its normal rhythm, or something close enough that I could pretend it had. We were, on paper, a good marriage. Sarah worked her 12-hour shifts at the hospital, 3 or 4 a week, and came home smelling like hand sanitizer and exhaustion, and I'd have dinner half made by the time she walked in. I coached, I graded papers, I coached some more. Jake had 2 more tournaments that summer, and I filmed every at-bat on my phone the way I had since he was 6, because some part of me has always understood that childhood disappears faster than you're braced for. But something had shifted, and it wasn't loud. It was more like a hairline crack in a windshield, invisible unless the light hits it exactly right, and then suddenly it's the only thing you can see. I found myself, without deciding to, looking at Jake differently. Not less lovingly, God, never less lovingly, but with a kind of scrutiny I'd never applied to him before, cataloging his features like I was building a case file on my own son, which felt disgusting even as I did it. His eyes were brown, mine are hazel, Sarah's are brown too, so that told me nothing. But his jaw, I found myself staring at his jaw at dinner one night, at the particular squared shape of it, and thinking about the man in the Waterloo dugout, whose face I'd only seen for maybe 4 seconds total but which had lodged itself in my memory with the stubbornness of a splinter. Something had shifted inside me. I couldn't name it yet, but I felt it every time I looked at my son's face over a bowl of spaghetti, and I hated myself a little more each time. I didn't ask Sarah anything else. Not because the question had gone away, but because some part of me had already started doing the cost-benefit math that avoidant men do without admitting it's math at all. If I ask and there's nothing there, I've insulted the mother of my child for no reason. If I ask and there is something there, I've broken something I don't know how to fix. Silence, in that framing, felt like the responsible choice. I've had a long time since then to recognize that it wasn't responsibility. It was fear wearing responsibility's clothes. I did one thing, though, that I'm not proud of and also can't regret, because it's the thing that started everything moving toward the truth. I looked up Todd. Not obsessively, just once, on a Tuesday night while Sarah was on shift, typing Todd Whitfield Waterloo Baseball into a search bar like I was checking a box rather than opening a door. He'd played college ball at a small school in Missouri, according to an old roster page. Graduated the same year Sarah finished nursing school. There was a decade-old photo from some regional tournament, him in his 20s, and I stared at it longer than a reasonable person stares at a stranger's old team photo, trying to find Jake in a face that had once been that age. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself this 3 or 4 times a week for the rest of July, which is itself a kind of answer to whether I actually believed it. Sarah, meanwhile, was different in ways I noticed and didn't examine. She started taking her phone into the bathroom when she showered, small thing, I told myself, everyone does that now. She over-explained a late shift one Thursday, giving me details about a patient crisis I hadn't asked for, more specific than the story needed to be, the kind of over-explaining that in hindsight reads like a woman filling silence because silence felt dangerous. I noticed it. I filed it under long shift, of course she's talking too much, and moved on. I want to stop here for a second, because if you've ever caught yourself staring too long at your own child's face, hunting for a resemblance you're terrified you might find, you already know exactly what those 2 weeks felt like. It's a specific kind of loneliness, being suspicious of the person you love most in a house where everyone else is still acting like nothing's wrong. Near the end of July, Jake had a growth spurt, the kind that comes on fast at that age, an inch in what felt like 10 days, and one evening while I was measuring him against the doorframe pencil marks we'd kept since he was 4, Sarah stood in the hallway watching, arms crossed over her chest in a way that looked almost protective, though I couldn't have told you of what. "He's going to be tall," I said, marking the new line. "Taller than you," she said, and smiled, but it didn't quite reach the rest of her face, and she left the hallway a beat faster than the moment called for. I pretended I hadn't noticed. I told myself it was nothing, the way I'd told myself a dozen small things were nothing that month, because noticing them out loud meant I'd have to do something about what I was noticing, and I wasn't ready to do anything yet. I didn't confront her. I didn't ask a single direct question that entire month. Instead, I did something quieter and, I think now, more cowardly. I ordered a home DNA test online, the kind marketed for ancestry curiosity, had it shipped to my classroom instead of the house, and told myself I was doing it to put my own mind at ease, to prove the paranoia wrong so I could stop being a man who stared too long at his son's jawline. I didn't open the box for 11 days. It sat in my desk drawer at school under a stack of ungraded essays, and every morning I looked at it before first period and every afternoon I looked at it before I left, and I could not make myself take the swab home. August arrived with the particular tension of a school year about to start, and I told myself the DNA kit sitting in my desk drawer was a closed matter, something I'd order out of a moment of weakness and would quietly throw away once the school year buried it under 100 other obligations. That's not what happened. What happened was that Jake made the all-star team, and the celebratory team dinner was held at a barbecue place downtown that, as luck or fate or something crueler would have it, was also hosting the Waterloo travel team's end-of-season banquet in the room next door. I stood at the buffet line with a paper plate of ribs, and Todd Whitfield walked past me toward the men's room, close enough that I could have reached out and touched his sleeve. Up close, it wasn't subtle. It wasn't a stranger's idle projection anymore. The jaw, yes, but also something in the set of the shoulders, the particular way he held his head slightly tilted when he was listening to someone talk, a gesture I'd watched my son make at the dinner table 1,000 times and always assumed, without ever once questioning it, had come from me. That was the first time I truly started to doubt, not the marriage, not yet, but the story I'd been told about how my son came into the world. I didn't approach him. I didn't say a word. I went back to our table, sat next to Sarah, and put my hand on the back of her chair like I always did, and if she noticed anything different in my face, she didn't say so, though something in how quickly she turned back to her conversation with another mom made me wonder, later, whether she'd clocked exactly who I'd just walked past. That night, after Jake was asleep and Sarah had gone to bed early with a headache she said had been building all day, I drove to my classroom at 9:30 at night, let myself in with my school keys, and took the DNA kit out of my desk drawer. Looking back now, that was the moment I should have asked the question out loud, at the dinner table, in front of everyone, instead of driving alone to an empty school building at night to swab my own son's cheek from a sample I'd have to smuggle out of the house without his mother knowing. But asking out loud meant admitting I already half believed the answer. Doing it in secret let me pretend I was still just being careful. I got Jake's sample 2 days later, under the cover story that I was helping with a school science project, a lie that made my stomach turn even as I said it, watching my son open his mouth trustingly for the swab, his eyes on the ceiling, humming some tune from a cartoon while I did something that felt, in that moment, like a betrayal of him even though I told myself it was the opposite, that I was protecting something, though I couldn't have said what. I mailed both samples the next morning before school, my own and Jake's, in an envelope I dropped in a mailbox 2 towns over, for no reason I could explain except that it felt important that no one who knew me handle that envelope. Then I waited. 2.5 weeks, according to the lab's timeline, which felt like the longest stretch of time I'd lived through since the 2 weeks Jake spent in the NICU as a newborn, the same specific flavor of dread, watching a small fragile thing and not knowing which way it was going to go. During those weeks, I watched Sarah more closely than I ever had in 12 years of marriage, and the things I saw, I now understand, were the sound of a woman managing a slow-motion collapse she'd been managing, in smaller ways, for almost a decade. She'd started sleeping badly. I noticed the extra trips to the kitchen at 2 a.m., the light under the bathroom door at hours she used to be dead asleep. When Jake mentioned, at dinner one night, that some man at practice today asked Coach Whitfield if he had kids, and that Coach Whitfield had laughed and said, "Not that I know of," an old baseball joke, the kind that gets a laugh in a dugout, Sarah's fork stopped halfway to her mouth for just long enough that I noticed, and Jake, oblivious, kept talking about his batting stance. I didn't say anything. Not because I didn't want to. Because some part of me was still hoping the lab would come back and make the whole thing disappear, and I didn't want to spend the last certain days of my old life starting a fight I couldn't take back. The results came on a Thursday, emailed to a private account I'd created specifically so nothing would show up on our shared devices. I read them standing in the school parking lot after last period, engine running, air conditioning blasting against an August heat that had nothing to do with why I was sweating. Probability of paternity, excluded. I sat in that car for 40 minutes. I don't remember most of what I thought during that time. I remember the specific, useless detail of a bird landing on my hood and staying there for almost a full minute, completely unbothered by the fact that on the other side of the windshield, a man's entire understanding of his life had just come apart at the seams. Even now, when I think back to that stretch of time in the parking lot, something uncomfortable stirs in my chest, not grief exactly, not yet. Just the specific, cellular knowledge that nothing that came after that moment was going to be the same as what came before it. I didn't confront Sarah that night, or the next, or for 11 days after the results came in. I want to be honest about why, because I think it's the part of this story that says the most about who I actually was underneath the version of myself I'd been performing for 12 years. I needed to build the whole picture before I could stand to look at any of it. That's the excuse I gave myself. The truth, I think, was closer to this. As long as I hadn't said the words out loud to her, I still had a version of my life that included a wife who loved me and a son who was entirely mine, even if I knew, with printed lab certainty in a folder I now kept locked in my classroom filing cabinet, that this version was already a lie. Silence let me live in the lie for 11 more days. I took them. During that time, I did the thing methodical men do when they don't know how to feel, I gathered. I pulled up old calendars on my phone, cross-referencing Jake's actual birth date against the wedding date, against the engagement dinner where Sarah had patted her stomach and joked about efficiency. I found, doing math I should have done 9 years earlier, that even accounting for a premature birth, the numbers only worked if Sarah had gotten pregnant almost 6 weeks before I remembered us first sleeping together unprotected, a detail that, once I let myself actually look at it instead of around it, could not be explained by anything except one thing. I found an old photo on Sarah's public social media from a decade back, a friend's caption at a bar, Sarah laughing next to a man I now recognized instantly. Todd. The photo was dated 4 months before she and I met at that 4th of July barbecue. In my mind, for 12 years, Sarah's dating history before me had been a vague, unexamined blank space I'd never thought to ask about, the way you don't ask about the chapters of a book that happened before the one you're reading. I found a text thread, 3 years old, buried in a family group chat where Sarah's sister had once typed, half joking, "Does Todd know Jake plays ball now LOL," followed immediately by Sarah's reply, "Don't. Seriously don't," and then nothing else, the conversation redirected within seconds to something about a birthday party. I'd scrolled past that exchange years ago without a second thought, the way you scroll past 100 throwaway lines in family chats. Now it sat in front of me like something excavated. That detail seemed insignificant at the time. It wasn't. I just hadn't yet learned to read my own life for the things it was trying to tell me. I want to pause here, because there's a version of this story where I found all of this and went straight into a rage that consumed everything. That's not what happened, and I think it's important to say why. What I actually felt, sifting through 9 years of small evasions I'd never once questioned, was a kind of vertigo, the sense that the floor I'd been standing on my entire adult life had never been solid, and I simply hadn't tested it because it had never once given me a reason to. I understood something in those 11 days that I've never said out loud to anyone until now. I hadn't been living inside a marriage. I'd been living inside a story I'd agreed, without knowing it, never to question. And not questioning it wasn't trust. It was fear dressed up as trust, because somewhere underneath all my calm, I think I always suspected that if I looked too closely at anything, the whole structure might come down, and I was right. There was one red herring during those 11 days that I have to mention, because it nearly derailed everything. Sarah's coworker, a nurse named Priya who I'd met at hospital holiday parties over the years, mentioned to me in passing at the grocery store that Sarah had been so stressed lately, ever since her mom's diagnosis, and for 2 full days I convinced myself that everything strange in Sarah's behavior traced back to a health scare in her family she hadn't told me about, a private grief I'd misread as guilt. I nearly let it go. I nearly filed the entire 9 days of investigation under wrong conclusion, poor husband, apologize and move on. Then I checked, quietly, and found Sarah's mother had, in fact, had a benign scare 8 months earlier that had already resolved, real, but old news, unrelated to anything happening now. The false lead cost me 2 days and a fresh wave of guilt for suspecting my wife of anything at all. It also taught me something about how easily a true detail, misapplied, can talk you out of a truth you already have proof of. On the 11th night, Jake asked me, unprompted, while I was tucking him in, why I'd been looking at him weird lately. 9 years old, and he'd noticed what his mother apparently hadn't, or had noticed and decided not to mention. Have I? I asked, keeping my voice light in a way that cost me more than anything else had that month. Kind of, he said, already half asleep. Like you're trying to figure something out. I told him I loved him, which was true and would stay true no matter what the folder in my filing cabinet said, and I sat on the edge of his bed for a long time after his breathing evened out, looking at a face I now understood I'd need an entirely new way of loving, not less, but differently, more deliberately, because the automatic biological thread I'd always assumed connected us had just been proven, in black and white, not to exist. The next morning, I printed a second copy of the lab results, put them in a plain folder, and drove to work knowing that I would confront Sarah that evening, whether I felt ready or not, because 11 more days of silence would have cost me something I wasn't willing to keep paying. I waited until Jake was at his grandmother's for a sleepover, which had been planned for weeks and which I hadn't engineered but which I was grateful for regardless, because some part of me had known, without admitting it, that this conversation could not happen with our son down the hall. Sarah came home from a day shift a little after 7, tired in the ordinary way, dropping her bag by the door the way she did every evening of our marriage. I was sitting at the kitchen table with the folder closed in front of me, and I think something in the stillness of the house, or the stillness of me, told her before I said a word that this was not an ordinary evening. "What's going on?" she asked, and her voice had already changed, quieter, careful. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't stand. I opened the folder and turned it so it faced her, and I said, I had Jake tested. And me. This came back 11 days ago. She looked at the paper for a long moment without picking it up. I watched her read the word excluded, and watched something in her face go very still, the particular stillness of someone doing rapid math on how much of the truth the room could survive. Where did you even get a kit like this?" she said, and her voice had shifted into something clipped, almost clinical. "Those things aren't reliable. Home tests have error rates, Ryan, you can't just." I used a certified lab. Not a mail-order gimmick. I kept my voice level, because I'd promised myself, driving home from school that day, that I would not let this conversation become the version where I lost control and she got to spend the rest of it managing my anger instead of answering my questions. "I need you to just tell me the truth." Here. Now. It doesn't mean what you think it means, she said, and there was something almost pleading underneath the clinical tone, though she didn't cry, didn't reach for me, didn't do any of the things I might have expected from a woman caught. Labs make mistakes. Samples get mixed up all the time, I've seen it happen at the hospital. Sarah. I said her name the way you'd stop a car rolling toward the edge of something. I did the math on the dates too. Before you say anything else, I know when Jake was actually conceived. I know it wasn't with me. She went quiet then, and for almost a full minute neither of us said anything, and the kitchen clock above the stove, a detail I will never be able to unhear, ticked loud enough that I noticed it for the first time in 12 years of living in that house. It's not what it looks like, she finally said, and even as she said it, something in her tone had already shifted from denial into something more like damage control. Todd and I were basically done by the time, it was one last time, closing something out, it wasn't, I didn't plan for any of this to happen the way it did. You let me raise a child for 9 years thinking he was mine. He is yours, she said, and for the first time her voice cracked, though her eyes stayed dry. Biology isn't, you were there for every single day of his life, Ryan, that has to count for something, that has to mean more than. It does mean something, I said, and I meant it, and saying it out loud while sitting across from the wreckage of everything else felt like holding two true things that shouldn't have been able to exist in the same sentence. It means I'm his father in every single way that matters to him. It doesn't mean you got to decide, alone, that I never got a say in knowing the truth about my own life. She tried, for a while longer, to reframe it, that it hadn't been a lie so much as an omission, that the timeline had genuinely been unclear even to her in those early confused months, that she'd convinced herself over the years it truly didn't matter because Jake had never known anything but me as his father, and wasn't that the actual truth, in the end, more than some lab result. Each time she reframed it, I set another piece of the timeline in front of her, the old photo, the sister's text, the 6-week gap her own OB records would have shown if anyone had ever looked. Each time, her version got smaller. I sat there and watched a woman I'd trusted completely for 12 years run out of room to maneuver, one printed page at a time, and there was no relief in it. Just a very heavy, very quiet kind of grief. She didn't break down that night. She didn't confess everything in full. What she did, close to 11, was go quiet in a different way, not defensive anymore, just exhausted, staring at the folder on the table like it was a verdict she'd finally accepted rather than argued. I need time, she said. I need to think about how to even talk about this properly. Not tonight. I can't do it justice tonight. I let her have that. Not because I'd forgiven anything, but because some part of me understood that whatever came next needed to be more than a reaction to being caught, it needed to be the truth, finally, in full, and I suspected, correctly, that the truth would come later, once the shock had worn thin enough for her to actually say it out loud. I slept in the guest room that night, for the first time in 12 years of marriage, and lay awake listening to a house that suddenly felt like it belonged to strangers. She came to me 4 days later, on a Sunday afternoon while Jake was at a friend's birthday party, and asked if she could finally say everything, without me interrupting, so she could get through it once and all the way to the end. She finally spoke. This is what she told me. It started the summer before I met you, when things with Todd were already falling apart but hadn't officially ended. We'd been together on and off for 2 years, and I knew, even then, it wasn't going anywhere good, he wasn't ready to settle, and I was terrified of turning 30 alone. There was one night, right at the end, almost like a goodbye neither of us said out loud, and I told myself afterward it didn't count for anything because we both knew we were done. I met you 6 weeks later, and it felt like being handed exactly what I'd been afraid I'd never get, someone steady, someone who wanted the same life I wanted. When I found out I was pregnant, I did the math in private, in the bathroom of my apartment, and I already knew. I told myself the timeline was close enough that no one would ever look closely, that a few weeks either way wouldn't matter to anyone but me. That was the first lie, and I told myself it wasn't really a lie, just a kindness, to both of us, to not complicate something that finally felt right. The premature birth story wasn't something I planned, it just happened to be true enough on the surface that I let it become the whole story, and once I'd let that happen once, I didn't know how to ever go back and unmake it. Every year that passed made it feel more impossible to say out loud, not less. Jake got older, you got closer to him, and telling you the truth stopped feeling like correcting a mistake and started feeling like it would destroy something that had already become real and good. I was scared every single day for 9 years, in ways I got very good at hiding. I couldn't look at the pediatrician's family history forms without my hands going cold. I couldn't watch Jake's face when he pitched without checking, every single time, whether anyone else in the stands was seeing what I saw. I tried to bring it up to you twice, years ago, once after his kindergarten graduation, once the night before his 7th birthday, and both times I got as far as, "There's something I need to tell you," before I lost my nerve and turned it into something else entirely. I am not going to tell you I'm sorry in a way that fixes anything, because I know it doesn't. I'm telling you because you deserve, finally, to have all of it, instead of the parts one decided you could handle. I listened to all of it without speaking, and when she finished, I didn't feel the relief people talk about when a truth is finally spoken whole. I felt the specific, heavy stillness of a man confirming something he'd already, somewhere underneath, known for a long time. I realized, sitting across from her in that quiet kitchen, that I hadn't been building a marriage for the last several years. I'd been maintaining the appearance of one, and telling myself that was the same thing, and Sarah, it turned out, had been doing an almost identical thing, just with a different secret underneath the floorboards. Todd's part in it came out over the following weeks, mostly through people neither of us controlled. Word travels fast in a baseball league that Small, his own wife, whom he'd married 2 years after Jake was born, filed for divorce within a month of hearing what her husband had known and never mentioned, choosing instead to coach against a boy who might be his own son rather than ever say a word. Todd lost his marriage, lost his standing with the Travel League board once the story got around informally, and by the following spring had moved out of Cedar Falls entirely. He never once reached out to Jake, then or since. Whatever he'd been protecting by his silence, he lost it anyway, the way people usually do. Sarah lost things too, plainly, without me needing to make her lose them further. She lost the version of herself she'd spent 9 years protecting, the woman who'd never really lied, just managed a complicated truth. She lost my trust completely, in a way I don't believe either of us thought could be rebuilt, no matter how many counseling sessions we sat through that fall, which we did, genuinely, both of us trying. She lost, eventually, the marriage itself. I left in November. Not in anger, by then the anger had mostly burned down into something colder and steadier, but because I understood, finally, that I could love Jake with everything I had, unconditionally, permanently, while still knowing I could not keep sharing a bed with the specific shape of the lie that had built our family. I told Jake, in age-appropriate pieces over the following year, that grown-ups sometimes keep hard secrets because they're scared, and that none of it was ever, in any way, his fault, and that I would be his father for the rest of both our lives regardless of anything a piece of paper said. I moved into a house 8 minutes from theirs. I have Jake every other week in every one of his games, home and away, and I have never once, in the 2 years since, let a single moment of what happened touch how I coach him from third base or how I hug him after a win. Sarah and I are civil, sometimes even easy with each other, co-parenting in the practical, wounded way divorced people learn to manage. She and Todd never spoke again after the divorce settled. She once told me, months later, that she didn't think she'd ever really loved him the way she loved the life she built afterward, which didn't undo anything, but it was, at least, finally, the truth. I left, and I never looked back at what our marriage had been. I look forward, instead, at a 9-year-old who still chews his glove strap when he's nervous, who still calls me dad in a voice that has never once wavered, because whatever else got broken in that house, that part was never a lie. The cruelest part of this story isn't the affair that happened before I ever met Sarah, it's the 9 years of small, deliberate maintenance it took to keep a truth buried once it had already taken root in the shape of a living, breathing boy. Sarah didn't tell one lie. She told a lie every single year she let me believe a lab's version of events over my own son's actual origin, and each year made the next one easier and more necessary, until silence had become its own kind of architecture holding up the whole house. What this story reveals about trust, I think, is something more specific than trust your gut. It's that trust untested for over a decade isn't necessarily strength. Sometimes it's just two people, independently, deciding it's easier to leave a structure unexamined than to find out whether it can bear weight. I never asked about the timeline because asking would have meant risking the story I preferred. Sarah never told the truth because telling it would have meant risking the story she preferred. We built a beautiful, functional home on top of two separate silences that happened to line up perfectly for 9 years, until a stranger in a set of bleachers, with no stake in either of our lives, said one true sentence out loud without knowing what he was setting in motion. What I've come to understand since is that the biological truth changed almost nothing about who Jake is to me, and almost everything about who I understood myself to have been for over a decade, a man who mistook not asking for peace, and who is only now, at 43, learning that real peace requires the risk of an answer you might not want. If there's a question worth sitting with here, it's not really about Sarah, or even about Todd, who lost more than either of us by choosing silence for reasons of his own. It's this: how much of what we call trust in our own lives is actually just fear of finding out we were wrong to give it? That question doesn't have a comfortable answer, and I'm not sure it's supposed to. I think about that stranger in the bleachers sometimes, a man I never met, whose name I never learned, who said one offhand sentence and then probably forgot about it by the time he got to his car. He has no idea what he started. I don't think I'll ever be able to explain to him, even if I somehow found him again, that his one careless comment did more honest work in 4 seconds than 9 years of my own quiet not looking ever did. What hurts most, if I'm being honest with you, isn't that Jake wasn't biologically mine. It's realizing how long I could have gone without ever knowing, how easily an entire life can be built and lived and loved inside a story that isn't quite true, if everyone involved is careful enough, and scared enough, to keep it that way. I don't know if you've ever built something on a silence you never tested. Most of us have, in one form or another. I hope, if you have, that whatever's underneath it gets found out gently, and by someone who still loves what's standing on top of it as much as I still love my son. If there's one word you'd use for someone who let you down, or a moment you chose not to look too closely at something, I'd genuinely like to hear it in the comments. And thank you for staying with this one all the way to the end. Some stories are hard to say out loud even once, you just let me say mine.